A man in a long gray coat walks alone up a mountain path. It is mid-morning in the Bavarian Alps. The air is thin and cold. He has done this almost every day he has been here. Left the house at about 10 o'clock and walked by himself the 20 minutes to a little tea house on the hill. He likes to be left alone on this walk, so his guards hang back, out of sight, among the pines. For one season in 1944, this is the most predictable thing the most hunted man on earth ever does, and somewhere in a quiet office in London, a small group of British officers know all of it. The route, the time, the trees. They know that for 20 minutes a day, Adolf Hitler is almost completely undefended. They build the plan to kill him, and then they decide not to use it. This is the story of Operation Foxley, the British plan to assassinate Adolf Hitler, approved on paper, planned in forensic detail, and then deliberately set aside. Not because it couldn't be done, but because the people who built it began to wonder whether killing Hitler would actually help them win the war. It is one of the strangest decisions of the Second World War, and to understand it, you have to start with a pile of captured enemies and the secrets they gave away. June 1944. The Allies land in Normandy and begin to break out across France, and with the advance comes something almost as valuable as ground: prisoners. Among the tens of thousands of captured German soldiers were men who had served in Hitler's own world, men from his headquarters, men from his guard detail, men who had stood close enough to the Führer to know how he ate, how he slept, and how he spent his mornings. In the interrogation rooms, the British listened, and slowly, out of 1,000 small details, a portrait took shape, not of a warlord, but of a man of fixed and lonely habits. The center of that portrait was a place called the Berghof. High in the mountains above the town of Berchtesgaden, on a slope called the Obersalzberg, Hitler kept his alpine retreat, a sprawling house with a vast picture window looking out over the peaks. This was where he went to think, to scheme, and to be seen, photographed against the mountains as the master of a continent. But a retreat is also a routine, and a routine is a weakness. The British learned two things that would become the heart of the plan. First, a tell. Whenever Hitler was in residence at the Berghof, a large swastika flag was flown from the pole by the car park in front of the house, and that flag could be seen from the town below, from a cafe, from a hillside. Anyone watching from Berchtesgaden could know at a glance that the most wanted man in the world was home. And second, the walk. Almost every morning, a little after 10 o'clock, Hitler walked, alone, from the house to a small tea house on a nearby hill, the Mooslannerkopf. It took about 20 minutes. He wanted solitude, so his guards kept their distance. For those 20 minutes, on a path through open ground and woods, Adolf Hitler was exposed. To a planner, that was not a habit. That was an opportunity. The work fell to the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army of saboteurs and spies, the organization he had founded to, in his words, set Europe ablaze. Inside SOE, its German directorate took the intelligence and began to build. Officers pored over aerial photographs and prisoner statements. They drew the routes, they timed the walk, and they gave the whole thing a code name that sounded like nothing at all: Operation Foxley. The centerpiece was simple in concept and brutally difficult in practice. A sniper, one or two marksmen, parachuted into the Bavarian Alps and dressed as Gebirgsjäger, German mountain troops, so they could move through the area without drawing a second glance. They would make their way to a firing position in the woods along Hitler's morning route, perhaps 100 yards from the path. And when the figure in the long coat came walking by, alone, they would take the shot. To make it work, the sniper would train with a German rifle, a Kar 98K, so the weapon, the ammunition, even the sound would fit the disguise. He would practice against moving targets, in conditions like the ones he would face on that mountain. One careful shot, at one predictable man on one quiet morning. But two foreign agents cannot simply appear on a German mountainside. They needed help on the ground, and here the plan turned on something almost human. Among the prisoners was a German soldier named Dieser, and Dieser had an uncle, a shopkeeper in Salzburg, barely 12 miles from the Berghof, a man described as fiercely, vehemently anti-Nazi. In the files, he is given a code name, Heidenthaler. He knew the country. He did his own target practice less than 10 miles from Hitler's estate. He could shelter the agents and move them toward Berchtesgaden disguised as mountain troops. The plot to kill the Führer ran, in the end, through one prisoner's family, through an uncle who hated what Germany had become. The planners knew one shot might not be enough, so Foxley grew a set of fallbacks, a menu of ways to kill one man. If the sniper missed and Hitler reached the tea house alive, a second team would ambush his car on the drive back, firing a Piet, a British anti-tank weapon, from the trees at the motorcade. And there was another idea, colder still. Hitler traveled in a private train, with a routine and a water supply that could be reached. The plan considered lacing that drinking water with a tasteless, lethal poison, botulinum toxin, so that the most powerful man in Europe might simply sicken and die, never knowing he had been touched. Sniper, ambush, poison. By late 1944, Britain had 3 credible ways to kill Adolf Hitler, written down and ready. If you made it this far, you're one of us. Hit subscribe and like. We unbury history every week. Now, back to our story. And then, at the very moment the plan was ready, the argument began. Because not everyone in SOE wanted to pull the trigger. The strongest objection came from a man inside the German Directorate itself, Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Thornley. The very people best placed to kill Hitler now argued, hardest of all, that they should not. Their reasoning was as cold as the plan itself. And it began with an uncomfortable truth. By 1944, Adolf Hitler was helping them win. By the second half of the war, Hitler had made himself a disastrous general. He overruled his own commanders. He forbade retreats that might have saved entire armies. He launched fantasy counteroffensives and ignored the men who actually understood war. One SOE assessment put it with brutal clarity. As a strategist, it said, Hitler had been the greatest possible assistance to the British war effort. So here was the terrible logic. Kill Hitler, and you might remove the single most useful blunderer on the other side. In his place could rise a competent soldier, a professional who listened to his generals, fought a smarter war and dragged the fighting out for months or years longer. A dead Hitler might cost more Allied lives than a living one. And there was a second fear, reaching past the end of the war into the peace that would follow. Germany, the objectors argued, was nearly beaten. Kill Hitler now, with the Reich collapsing, and you risk making him a martyr. You hand the German people a story, that their leader had been struck down by foreign assassins just before the end, and that, had he only lived, Germany might somehow have won. It was the old, poisonous stab-in-the-back myth, waiting to be born again. Far better, they said, to let Hitler go down with the regime he had built, to let him own the ruin completely. A defeated, discredited Hitler in his bunker was worth more than a murdered Hitler on a mountain. On the other side stood those who wanted to act. Churchill himself was drawn to the idea of striking at Hitler. Senior officers argued the simple, human case, that killing the man at the center of so much death might shorten the war and end the killing sooner. The plan was ready. To waste it was its own kind of failure, but the doubts won. Not in a single dramatic vote, but in the way these things usually end. The plan was submitted in November 1944. The arguments went back and forth. The window at the Berghof was already closing, because Hitler had stopped going there, and no one ever gave the final order to go. Operation Foxley was not rejected so much as allowed to fade. The shot was never fired. The poison was never poured. The man in the long coat kept walking. There is one more reason to pause over Operation Foxley, because for all its forensic detail, the dossier was also, in places, badly wrong. It listed Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, who would die at his side, as his secretary. It claimed Hitler had lost the power of speech when he had not. It reported that Heinrich Himmler was now running Germany, when he was not. It said the Goebbels family had broken apart, that Magda Goebbels had taken her children to safety in Switzerland, when in truth, she would carry them into the Berlin bunker and let them die there. This was Britain's best intelligence on its most important enemy. and it was confidently, comprehensively mistaken about the people closest to him, and the human margin was thinner than anyone admitted. When the files finally surfaced, decades later, the family of one of the candidate marksmen revealed something that should give every planner pause. The man considered for the most important shot in history was, by his own wife's account, astigmatic in one eye, and a poor shot. The